Take a seat so we can get started with our event. So welcome, thank you all for coming today. I'm Matt Chingos, I direct the Education Policy Program at the Urban Institute. I'm excited for what I expect to be a stimulating conversation. I see this as a bit of an opportunity to step outside of our DC bubble for an hour and a half and set aside federal policy issues for the most part. Maybe we'll talk about it a little bit, and really hone in on what's happening on the ground in a number of states around the country when it comes to school funding. So we're fortunate today to have Corey Turner from NPR here to moderate the discussion among our expert panel. Corey will introduce them. You'll get to hear from them in a moment, and you have all their bios, except for one exception. We have a last-minute change. Unfortunately, Jessica Handy from Stand for Children Illinois was unable to come due to illness, but fortunately, at the very last minute, she's been replaced by her colleague, Mimi Rodman, who has been the executive director of Stand for Children Illinois since 2012. Under her leadership, Stand for Children Illinois has progressed from a startup to a statewide organization, and she's a lawyer by training and a former partner at Kirkland & Ellis. So I'd encourage you to tweet about the conversation today using the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. And when we get to the Q&A portion later, those of you who are in the room can raise your hand and ask a question. But those of you who are watching online to the webcast, who I also warmly welcome to the conversation today, should feel free to email your questions in to events@urban.org. So thank you again for coming. Welcome, and Corey, take it away.
Thank you, Matt. So my goal for this panel is to do as little of the talking as possible. So what I'm going to do is give a very brief introduction to each of our guests and then give them a couple of minutes to introduce themselves to you. And then we will start hashing out the questions, and I'll tell you what I told them before we just started. If they want to jump in and interrupt and build on what each other are saying, please don't be polite and wait for me to ask a question. I love when conversations build organically. That's when they get exciting and productive and constructive and surprising. So we'll start with you, Mimi. What I have here is Executive Director of Stand for Children Illinois, which Matt already said. Stand, for those of you who don't know, is a national education advocacy nonprofit dedicated to ensuring that all children, regardless of their background, graduate from high school prepared for and with access to college or career training. Right. What else would you like us to know?
About myself or about Stand?
Both.
I'm the Executive Director of the Illinois operation of Stand for Children. And we were, in the context of school funding, very honored to be able to play a role as an advocate and also as an influencer on the policy side of it last year when the formula was actually passed.
All right. And now Sherry Runner. Sherry is President and CEO of the Chicago Urban League, and she leads the strategic planning, development, programming, and community outreach for the organization, which is one of the largest of the 88 affiliates of the National Urban League.
That's right. We are a 100-year-old civil rights organization based as an affiliate in the city of Chicago, in the state of Illinois, which speaks volumes for why I am interested in education and funding, with many of the issues in terms of our focus on economic empowerment for African American communities and looking at education as a centerpiece for that.
Okay. Jason Willis is Director of Strategy and Performance in the Comprehensive School Assistance Program at West Ed. You're going to have to break that down. I'll break that down for you. Which includes supporting state, regional, and local education agencies to align their policies, strategies, and accountability. Break that down, would you?
Yeah, so the basics, so West Ed is a national research development service agency. Our work within CSAP, it was a kind of internal lingo, is primarily supporting states and districts around the ways they think about their resources and aligning that towards better educational outcomes, primarily around equity. I come to this work at West Ed about 2 years ago, having served in local urban systems in California, places like San Jose, Stockton, and Oakland, where the need for these students we know is absolutely tremendous, and being able to find ways to strengthen those policies to deliver what they need to be our educated youth of the future.
All right, and then finally we have Katie Roy. Director and founder of the Connecticut School Finance Project, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit that aims to incorporate the viewpoints and perspectives of stakeholders to develop fair, well-thought-out solutions that help create a sensible and equitable, a big word that I hope we hear a lot of today in the next hour, school funding system that meets the needs of Connecticut and all of its public school students.
Yeah, so the Connecticut School Finance Project is a little bit of a unique organization in that we are a state level organization that focuses just on school funding policy. So we work with stakeholders throughout the state of Connecticut, both at the state and local levels, to help them better understand school funding, to bring together people who are interested in working together to improve the state's school finance system, and finally to work to develop policy solutions.
Okay, so I think we'll start broad and see where it takes us. And I'm just curious, and feel free to jump in. I'm not gonna call on you. What are some of the biggest misconceptions out there, you think, when it comes to creating a funding formula at the state level? What do you want people to understand from your personal experience? Okay, I will call it.
I'll be happy to hop in.
There you go.
Okay. So I think that one thing is to understand is there's the formula, and then there is what you do with that formula once it's passed. They're both epic journeys, I think, potentially, and we've just crossed the first one of getting the formula passed. It was a 4-year battle. It was many draft bills, many task forces, an incredible amount of collaboration, some very dedicated legislators. It is a long slog, and I think it's very important to set that expectation and that understanding and that commitment from the outset. It's going to be hard.
And I'll add to that, since we're both Illinoisans. The Urban League filed a lawsuit against the Illinois State Board of Education to get the funding formula changed starting in 2008. It was almost 9 years before the lawsuit was settled and any real change occurred. So for us, when we look at this funding formula, it becomes very political, and it has always been very political in Illinois, with Chicago being one of the largest recipients of state funding, but also one of the neediest areas. So there's a lot of back and forth and pull between what happens downstate and around the state, and a difference to Chicago.
I think that in Connecticut, and just for a little background on where Connecticut is at the moment, I find that people think certain things about Connecticut. So Connecticut has actually had a multi-year budget deficit situation. For the last 2 fiscal years, the state entered those years with deficits between 10 and 15% that it needed to close. Over the next couple of fiscal years, we're again looking at deficits of about 10% a year. In addition to that, our fixed costs, so those costs that are related to pensions and long-term debt obligations, have risen to be about 50% of the state's overall budget. So that means when we're thinking in real terms, when we're talking about the non-fixed cost portion of our budget, we're talking about 20% of that budget needing to be reduced or made up for through revenue in order to balance the state's budget. So we've been working on school funding in the context of having a very significant state deficit that we've had to deal with. And I think one of the lessons that we learned through updating the school funding formula over the past year was a couple of things. First, not all towns necessarily need to be held harmless to update a school funding formula. I think that that's kind of a common piece of school funding wisdom that did not hold true in Connecticut. We updated our formula. About half the districts received less funding. Those tended to be our wealthier districts with fewer need students, and about half of our districts received more funding over the phase-in period. And those are mostly districts that are lower wealth with greater amounts of need students. So if you're in a state that's facing a deficit situation, you can do it in a part new money, part redistribution way, which isn't something that prior to us doing this, I heard people talking about a lot.
Well, this is one of my big questions, I think. If you're talking about not holding every community harmless, you're essentially telling their lawmakers and the people you're going to lose money. How does that conversation play out, politically speaking? How is that even, I mean, as a reporter, I've seen lots of stories of this process where that's when it falls apart.
Yeah. So I think in Connecticut, there were a couple of things that happened that were important. So many of you may be familiar with the CJEF case, the Connecticut Coalition for Justice and Education Funding case, and many of you may have read or heard about the Superior Court decision by Judge McCousher that was a very sweeping decision about Connecticut's school finance system and education system generally. That decision came out in the fall of 2016, prior to the start of the legislative session in 2017. And one of the things that provided was there was suddenly a focus on school funding and education generally that really had not been there. And it happened at the same time as we had this very significant deficit that the state was trying to deal with. So I think policymakers, because of the McCousher decision, felt a lot of urgency to do something about school funding and realized that they needed to make progress on that even in the face of a deficit. So I think one of the reasons that the state was able to move forward on this is, one, the deficit situation ultimately led to Connecticut passing a bipartisan budget, which is something that hasn't happened in Connecticut in more than a decade. And as part of that solution, some districts had been faced over the course of the legislative session potentially with the option of receiving no state education funding any longer. So the compromise ended up being a situation in which some districts did lose some education funding, but they lost it gradually over time. So that funding is being phased out over a 10-year period. New funding is being phased in over a 10-year period. But given the budget situation, I think people came to realize that Connecticut was going to need to change the way that it dealt with education funding because it is such a significant portion of the budget. And it ultimately became preferential to have a plan that everybody could plan for year over year rather than something that happened suddenly.
I'm curious, I don't want to lose you, Jason, but since Illinois just went through this, and I know that local funding in Illinois is really regressive, how did you guys resolve this? Are some communities, did they stand to lose state dollars, or what was the...
Well, I can certainly speak to the kind of circumstances in California. I find it interesting, as Katie's pointing out, that this conception of hold harmless kind of stood up in Connecticut as not necessarily being a barrier. In California's first pass at this, which was one of the states that we've been working with for quite some time, the measure actually failed on the very provision of hold harmless. At the time, California was ranked nearly 47th in the country in terms of per pupil funding. I think perhaps the kind of saturation of funding might have something to do with that. On the second try, kind of rebranding, right? Messaging matters a lot. It kind of passed with sweeping support throughout California with a hold harmless provision in play. But the catch was that for those systems that had larger proportions of underserved kids in California, they define that as low income, English learner, and foster youth populations. Their acceleration of funding was significantly faster than a lot of other systems. We now see that kind of borne out in some of the research that's been done in California, and we're starting to see some pretty positive impacts in summative outcomes as well, particularly graduation. One of the other interesting things that I think is important to consider here is the interplay between what the state perceives it has the ability to do, meaning how much they can put into K-12 education, as compared to the revenues in which they are bringing into the state. Kind of juxtaposing the circumstance of California, you have a state like Kansas, who had resolved their Montoy case some 10 or 12 years ago, and you have leadership that came in that wanted to run a pretty grand experiment with state government and kind of pulling back on tax revenues for supports that kind of drove the system back into the courts, the education system back into the courts. And for them, their perception is really one of, we don't have the funding to do it because they don't want to necessarily raise taxes. That's the kind of reflection of their constituents as a means to driving improvement. And what we found in Kansas is that, largely the system districts, that is, are doing everything they possibly can and getting a pretty good return, if you will, on their educational investment in terms of outcomes relative to the amount that they're investing.
Corey, can I underscore something on
Sure.
the hold harmless point? So if you could see my notes, you'd literally see that the first point says, you almost always have to have a hold harmless. So I'm fascinated that Connecticut was able to manage around that. For us, it was sort of the way the debate was defined from the beginning because of political reasons, because of the way that the state's geography is set up. It's Chicago versus downstate and suburbs. And it really became an impossible, there were moments in which that looked like something that was unsurmountable. The way that, in my opinion, we were able to get over that as a state was when downstate and suburban and urban areas and the school leaders were able to unify, and the legislators were able to look at this issue from an equity lens and from a statewide solution.
But how does that happen? That is not a spontaneous.
Well, in our formula, everyone is held harmless, and then
Yeah, that's how it happens.
and then this is a political reality as well. So it's only the new money that flows.
Is
through
it
the formula.
time limited? Is it held harmless for 10 years, or is it?
It goes on for quite a bit of time. Yeah.
Okay. Huh. Sharon,
Well,
you know?
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, in most states where you see these hold harmless provisions come into funding formula reforms, there's a big bet. And the bet is that states' tax revenues will continue to grow along with the promise of additional funding into K-12, but also kind of other places as well. That story has been true in California. Our economy has been roaring now for some 7 or 8 years. Other states, particularly in the Southwest and in the western part of the country, places like New Mexico, Utah, Nevada, and Arizona have struggled. You've seen the kind of uprising of teacher protests that I think have some intertwine in there as well. And so you see a struggle with states that are trying to push more funding to K-12 education but can't find the places in which to actually get the funding to go into the K-12 system.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear from each of you. What do you think now when it comes to coming up with a more equitable funding formula? What are some of the biggest roadblocks beyond what we've talked about, the politics of the hold harmless? Are there other things that might not be intuitive, but that you've all seen now in your personal experience? And the remedies that you've...
I mean, you touched on the politics, but I think, these fundamentally, when you're working with state legislatures on funding formulas, it's a political process. So you might have in your mind, ideally, this is exactly what we would like, a perfectly equitable school funding formula to look like. The likelihood that you're going to be able to achieve that without making some political compromises is pretty much impossible. So I think there are things that can help. So the McCousher decision really helped to shine a bright light on some of the education equity issues that we have in Connecticut, and I think led to a greater groundswell of support among legislators to say we really have to do something to deal with this. But I don't think that even that isn't going to take you out of the politics entirely, right? You're still going to have to deal with the fact that there are political realities in the state. I think that what those solutions look like vary from state to state, depending on the very specific context that you're working in. But you have to be aware that there should be certain sort of goals and values for your funding formula, but you also need to be practical about how that formula is going to be developed so that it's something that the legislature can actually work with.
And so I guess where I would add to this conversation, and it's sort of tangential, but it's actually realistic in the environment in which we exist right now, this issue of race and schooling in general, and how it is looked at in terms of lower income being associated with African American or people of color generally, and what that does to the political discussion at the heightened sense of where we are right now. And so that always feeds into the argument and the discussions that we have to have in Illinois, because Chicago is looked at this as this big succubus of a place that's just taking everything away from everybody else who lives in the state. And so we have to start to think about what does that mean in terms of if we're not educating our children, and what are the longer term impacts of having education funding not be equitable across the state. There are a lot of different issues that flow from funding. This issue of choice and what does that mean for our students, and how funding is then allocated even with a formula. There is, just the whole issue of whether or not education is right. in each individual state. And so I think those are the important pieces of the discussion that flow from this idea of what equitable funding looks like.
Well, I want to talk about what equitable funding looks like, because I think that may be the single most important question we'll tackle today. And especially, as you said, when we talk about kids who are coming into the system disadvantaged, I mean, we know there's good research that says we need to spend more money in these schools that serve these kids. They're coming in with more needs. How do you make that argument when, at a sort of policy level and a political level? How do you make the argument that a state's disadvantaged kids, they don't need equal funding. They need more funding. Mm-hmm. And then how do you define, like, how do you know when you've reached equity? Like, what is the ding? Especially the political ding, when you can say, oh, there we are, that's good enough.
So let me jump in on a couple of, so I think there's a couple ways that states have framed this. Through debates in the court, right? That's been our, a major way in which we've defined that. Previous to adequacy, it was the equity debate. And you can, I think Katie says this very eloquently, that the court debates basically shine a light on some of the places in which the state hasn't been meeting its responsibility relative to what they say in their constitution. I think the second place is really this notion of a kind of diverse coalition, that in a lot of places where you see these conversations around equitable funding for kids that need it, you see a more diverse coalition, people that are coming together from all kind of walks of life across the political spectrum, rural and urban, because they want to be able to correct the way that states are thinking about funding their districts and their schools. We were in a conversation earlier, and one of the things that I think it was actually Katie's crew that kind of coined this term of the generally interested party. And I think you got to break it down, as Corey says, for that generally interested party. Like when I walk into my son or daughter's school, I want to know what it means to have more equitable funding in that school as compared to another. And so that I know for my kids, they may not need an additional social worker. They may not need an additional counselor or an extra teacher in the classroom as much as another student that is coming from a background in which English isn't their first language, or in which they struggle academically because of a learning disability. And I think you have to play out how those resources look in different circumstances and places for schools as a means to let the general public understand what it actually looks like. Because for a finance and Excel geek like me, like most of the people in this room, we could talk all day about the dollars, right? And it totally makes sense to us. But for most people on the ground, and I would say in particular policymakers, they're looking to answer the question for a constituent, how is this piece of policy going to change what's happening in my local district, in my local community? And a way to do that is to think about the different people, the different arrangements of those resources in those schools as a means to be able to explain what is going to look different as a result of the policy that's being debated.
I mean, in Connecticut, I think our policymakers overall, all the leaders of all of our caucuses, regardless of party, the governor's office, all of them fundamentally understood that different kids come to school with different learning needs, and it is the role of the state to help make sure that all of those kids have access to educational opportunities. So there wasn't really any pushback from state policymakers about the idea that education funding needed to be equitable. Now, what the specifics of that look like, a more difficult conversation, but there was, at this point, I think there's been enough research and discussion in the legislature about the need for equity in education that they fundamentally got that. There's also a part of our work, though, where we work directly with community members all around the state, from little kids through adults, church basements, school board members. And one of the things we did a lot with those groups was to talk about equity and, to Jason's point, exactly what equity looked like. So why might a student who comes from a low-income situation need additional resources? What does that actually look like in the classroom? What additional resources might an English language learner or a special education student need? So people could understand, oh, okay, these are the types of things that I would see in those classrooms that are different. And then, yes, I can understand why those resources would cost additional dollars, and those additional dollars need to be provided. Did every single person in the state get behind that? No, but did the vast majority majority of people understand that and it made sense to them, yeah, definitely.
And where you concentrate that messaging, I think, is also important. The general public is not really the general public across the state. It's literally within the areas where you've got legislators, right, who need to be influenced the most. And I think that's a huge effort, particularly in a state the size of Illinois.
Can I also just pick up on one other strand? You, Corey, I think eloquently kind of said, when do we ring the bell on equity? I think in this case, kind of talking about resource equity. So, in the kind of research literature, there's been, cost function approaches have been kind of popularized as a way in which to, depending on the data you have, try to determine like the amount of additional money beyond a general education student that would be necessary. And I would say that that's a pretty blunt instrument, and that in most cases, states really have to consider this as a work in progress. They need to create for themselves mechanisms to understand whether or not the additional funding that they're putting into the system is doing the things that they intended them to do. I think it's impossible for any state policy to kind of know and foresee the future of all those nuances and circumstances and to write those out in law out of the gate. And so you need those places in future, a year, 3 years, 5 years, to say, how are we doing not only in the distribution of resources, thinking about those as dollars, but also potentially mechanisms of people and the work you're doing with other agencies and local systems, but also what outcomes are you deriving as a result of that, right? So some progress has been seen in California, initial progress, summative outcomes in graduation rates, particularly for underachieved kids, more mixed results on our ELA and math tests, but it is certainly not the end of that conversation as we continue to see some pretty persistent gaps in places like California. And so I would say the bell is the goal, but being able to come back together as diverse coalitions to assess how are we doing and what more do we need to do to continue moving down that path is the advice that we've offered to states as they think about those policies.
I'm glad you brought that up, because obviously when we talk about school funding, we often lean into resource equity, but I'm curious to hear from the rest of you, where is the balance between talking about dollars and getting more dollars into the schools that need them and talking about outcome equity, or at least like trying to connect the resources to some kind of improvement, and how you define improvement beyond good old-fashioned test scores? I mean, California is really interesting to me because of all the different measures that districts are using to measure the benefit students may be deriving from this funding. And I'm just curious, I don't know if Illinois is doing anything like this, or Connecticut, but where do outcomes fit into this conversation?
Well, I mean, I think if you think resource equity is difficult to talk about, I think outcome equity is probably even way more difficult to talk about. But because we come from a state that initially allocated funding based on property taxes, so obviously those property tax poor districts were the ones with the least resources. And so when we talk about resources going into schools, not just for social workers or for special education teachers, but even for those things that richer districts can provide, like sports, playing fields, music, all of those things that surround, that we can specifically point to that enhance education in ways that I don't know that, I mean, we know it, it's in research, we know that those things are important and need to be part of a youth's schooling, that you have to really start to think about when those resources are allocated in ways that, other kinds of organizations that exist in richer districts, what are you really looking for? And how do you measure, a kid who becomes a songstress or a great cellist or something else as a result of the resources that were allocated in that district, while may have graduated from high school, maybe not, going on to some other thing, but that we know that there was an impact there. And so those are really difficult. That's the granularity of the outcome discussion that you have to have talking about outcomes.
Yeah.
So in Illinois, I wanted to add on that. So our new money under our appointment just literally got released in April. So we're very new into the point at which we're seeing how this money is going to manifest itself and how it's going to be good for kids. what I'm seeing, and I think is a credit to a lot of the advocates in the space here, is putting real names and real faces on that and saying, so for example, we had new $350 million new dollars put into the formula last year, and saying that $350 million will literally get you 3,500 guidance counselors, and that will get you, and if you think about that and what the recommended ratios are, that, those sort of messages resonate with people individually, because I think while everybody, the equity conversation is there, and I think there's an acceptance of equity, it's really about what's your self-interest in being able to see that at your school level. The other point that I would like to make on this one is, so we're still not done, and it's going to be really important. I think the communications part of this is really, really important. So we literally are, today's the second to last day of our general session, and our education budget and the whole budget for the state hopefully will be voted on sometime before midnight tomorrow, and we need at least another $350 million over last year in order to make this formula work and be equitably distributed.
No guarantees.
No guarantees. I'm not going to Vegas, but we'll see.
We've talked a little bit about the role of the courts in school funding, and I'm curious to hear more from you all about the benefits of that, and if there's any downside to these long, seemingly intractable cases. I mean, I know some of them have lasted for a decade or more. Is there collateral damage to litigating school funding?
Probably. I mean, look, I think that, I think that court cases are a double-edged sword. On the one hand, I think they can really help to shine a light on, some of the adequacy and equity issues that states have, and to force states to reckon with situations and inequities that they may not really want to deal with and would rather push aside. I also don't think that court cases are going to be the full solution to this. At the end of the day, education funding is an appropriations matter. It is ultimately going to be the legislature who is going to have to fix this problem in every single state. You can have a court case, but you also need the legislature in order to actually get it done. The interesting thing about Connecticut is I talked about the court case and I talked about the window of opportunity that it gave us, but CJEF ultimately lost that court case. So in January of this year, Connecticut's Supreme Court reversed the decision of Judge McCoucher and held that Connecticut's school funding system is not unconstitutional under the Connecticut Constitution. There are a lot of folks who might disagree with the outcome of the Supreme Court's ruling, but the fact of the matter is they are the court of final decision in Connecticut, and that is the outcome of the case. But even though that is the outcome of the case, the decision, the earlier Superior Court decision, and the fact that the court case existed created the space to have a conversation that I don't think we otherwise would have had. It's obviously impossible to predict what would have happened if the plaintiffs had won in that case, because that didn't happen. But I do think that there is utility in them, but I don't think they're the only solution, and I don't think they're the whole solution.
I would have to agree. I mean, I think when we settled with the State Board of Education, the real work began into determining what the school funding formula was actually going to look like. But I think without the court case, the light would not have been shown on the deficiencies in our system and the necessity to do something, because it had existed as it was forever. So, and it was getting worse. And it seemed, I think, very disingenuous to have people running for statewide offices who touted education as their, major issue, and that this was the most important thing, but didn't want to do anything about inadequate or inequitable funding. So I think that having the court case, having somebody with the foot on the neck of our State Board of Education for a period of time made the legislature decide that they must do something about it. I think I'm going to move to Connecticut because none of our legislators ever wanted to do anything. I mean, they really had to be forced, so it was important to have the case.
Yeah. I think part of what we're hearing is that court battles help with some assurance of minimum. And I think there's, even within the court cases themselves, a level of debate about what is the minimum. Which in some ways kind of protracts you from getting to the questions of what does it mean to actually provide an excellent education for kids in our states? We've seen examples, California being one, in which prior to the question of, or even the kind of notion of something like LCFF coming to mind, we had a series of nearly 3 court battles kind of working their way through California's court system. And those all but disappeared when, I think we've seen in Illinois and places like Connecticut and other places, a diverse set of stakeholders come together, both inside and outside of government, and said, we're done. We're finished with this, wanting to kind of fight this out in court. We want to find a path forward that is really going to be productive for our kids, and is really going to reflect kind of our values in the way that we think about state policy, particularly for education funding. The other point that I'll make is, particularly around kind of collateral damage is the way you put it, Corey, and I think there's quite a significant amount of collateral damage. Our court system is set up as plaintiffs and defendants, in many cases winners and losers. And it's not like, these people come in for a stint of a year or two and then go away. Like, you are working with these people day in and day out. Like, they are the people that are helping to define state policy. They are the ones that are setting the tone within the state. And so while it certainly helps to kind of assure the minimum, trying to find some opportunity for coalition building is probably the more advised path forward when you try to think about what it means to provide additional resources to kids that need it in our states, and ways in which local stakeholders, particularly district administrators, actually have to enact this work going forward.
We've heard a lot about a few states represented on this stage: Connecticut, Illinois, some California. I want to hear from you. What are the exemplars out there? States that you feel like they've really found that balance. They've come up with a really good funding formula that's equitable, that's fair, that didn't tear the state apart, and that is sustainable. What is the gold standard?
I think everybody's school funding formula is a perpetual work in progress. I mean, I don't know, talking with colleagues around the United States, I haven't talked with anybody in any state who said, aha, we have it. And some of the national researchers in this room, to the best of my knowledge, have now pointed at a formula and said, aha, this is the one. But I think part of that is because state funding formulas are very specific to each individual state context. I think even if you were able to point to an exemplar state and say that state is doing a good and perfect job for that state, you could take that funding formula and then try to apply it in another state, and it wouldn't work at all. It wouldn't have the same effect. So, I think there's always things that we're going to need to improve in school funding. So I don't want to give anybody the impression that I think the work in Connecticut is done. We made some progress. There are other things that we still need to deal with. This formula has a 10-year phase in and phase out. Connecticut still has a really difficult fiscal picture. It's going to be a challenge to stick to that phase in, phase out over the next 10 years. We still have some real issues we need to deal with, both in the areas of special education funding and how we fund our sort of maze of schools of choice. I know charters are an issue in a lot of states, but in Connecticut we actually have many more inter-district magnet schools than charters, so we have sort of a mix of different types of choice programs, and we have not done anything to sort out that funding formula situation. So, and I see those as continuing works in progress for Connecticut. I don't know, do any of you know of states with perfect funding formulas?
No, I think
Not perfect, but something to aspire to?
Something to aspire.
Something to keep us cozy at night? I don't know.
So I would reframe the question, not as like, is there a formula to aspire to, but more about, is the funding formula that a state has enacted, is looking to reform, helping to achieve the desired outcomes the state wants for its kids? And I think if you investigate these adequacy debates and you were to ask questions like, is there a common outcome that the state writ large really wants for its kids, you have these kind of vague references to things like the Rose capacities from the '82 ruling in Kentucky. But the state hasn't come around its own kind of definition of what it wants for kids. The closest that I've seen to something like that is probably a state like Massachusetts. They have been on this road of ed reform now for nearly 20 or 25 years. have gone through various versions of strategic planning. I think California has started on that road, but they've yet to kind of figure it out for themselves, particularly around the student outcome piece. I mean, I think the dashboard they reference in California as their kind of various indicators of achievement are good, but if you were to ask them, like, what do we want for kids in California, I don't think they could give it to you in an elevator pitch. So I would kind of reframe that. I think it's, I think this notion of states really wanting to do this on behalf of their kids is very local and specific, and probably a better way to think about it, as opposed to, there's a gold standard of funding formulas.
And I think Massachusetts, your Massachusetts example, really points to the fact that when states make progress on education of issues, it's a constellation of policies. So Massachusetts did comprehensive funding reform in the 1990s. Arguably, that formula needs to be updated because it's a little bit out of date, but it wasn't just a funding reform policy that Massachusetts put into place. They put a series of reform policies into place that they've gone back and continued to revise and update, and as they have achieved certain goals or not achieved them, said what policies do we need to change in Massachusetts in order to get to where we want our kids to be. And I think you see in Massachusetts outcomes that they've made a lot of progress toward that. But fortunately, even the people in Massachusetts don't think their work is done, right? It's our neighbor to the north. When we talk to them, folks in Massachusetts can still point to any number of additional policy changes they need to make, or any number of ways in which they're still not meeting the needs of all their kids, particularly their highest need kids. And they're still really committed to doing that. So I think, this funding piece is obviously critically important, but it's not going to do it on its own. I think you need a whole group of policies to move it forward.
I'm going to take a quick moment now to let all the folks who are watching the streaming version of this, we're going to open it up to questions in just a couple of minutes. So if you have a question out there, you can email it to events@urban.org. All right? I don't want to open it to questions just yet, though, because we haven't talked about the teacher walkouts and the debates over teacher pay that have really been shaking up a number of states. And I'm curious how you see this fitting into the overall, funding formula landscape. Is this a good thing that it's elevating the conversation of school funding in lots of different places, or is it more complicated, since we know that teacher pay doesn't always track when we're talking about equity? Yeah. What do you think?
Cherry?
No, I was just going to sort of add on to what you both just said, in the sense that the whole idea of paying attention to the need for new funding formulas has brought to the attention of a lot of policymakers and people generally that one issue. So when, in as much as there may not be a gold standard, or that they all are works in progress, that this issue of teachers recognizing their value and their importance in these systems is an offshoot of that. And I think that that's very important, because then people start to talk about the overall educational landscape, which doesn't just depend on one thing. It is a conglomeration of a lot of things.
Now, teacher pay in and of itself was not a single conversation point in the school funding debate. It was a comprehensive, holistic approach, and I think part of this also was because we spent a lot of time, and we ultimately enacted an evidence-based model which listed many elements which a school would look at, a school district would look at in order to calculate what adequacy was.
I would say that this issue of teacher walkouts is our canary in the coal mine when it comes to K-12 funding. And I say that for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, this struggle between teacher pay, let me say, kind of pay in general to K-12 administrators and staff versus what are obligations to health and pension benefits is an issue that has largely gone kind of unchecked, if you will. If you take a look at national data that we have over the last quarter century, this shift just in the proportion of dollars that are going to salary versus benefits has grown by nearly 14 percentage points. Now that may look small in terms of a percentage, but in terms of the billions and billions of dollars that have been redirected into pension and other health and benefit categories are dollars that are not able to be realized in salary. Now, I'm not, we certainly not going to pass judgment on whether that is a good thing or a bad thing, but the reality is it's putting strain on K-12 budgets. And so when I talk to the countless chief financial officers that are trying to balance their books on a month-to-month and a year-to-year basis, this is a constraint that they don't really have a lot of control over. These are promises that were made by our predecessors in states and local districts that we are in some ways now kind of coming home to roost. And we have to face that reality in one way or another. Those are obligations that we have made to our fellow citizens for their time spent doing really hard and incredible work on behalf of kids, with the fact that we still have a lot of needy kids in this system. And so how do we think about not just the K-12 budget in that regard, but how do we also think about how states think about funding K-12 education overall? I think the other kind of factor in this case is really having states think about their allocation of resources overall. We spend billions upon billions of dollars in our prison systems, in other social and safety nets, that, with consideration of the way that those services are offered to our citizenry that could be redirected to K-12 education, might offer some relief. We're kind of used to this in K-12 education. We kind of fight amongst the scraps that we have, right? We don't think about the larger pie. And when we step back and say, what might we do in terms of other areas of spending within a state's budget, or better yet, what might be other revenue streams that we can rely upon as a means to drive funding to education, I think you might start to get a different conversation as a result of what we're seeing now, which is basically millions upon millions of teachers walking out and saying, you know what, we're fed up. And the other thing, while you can't really kind of monetize this, but I think has a really important impact, is the way that we talk about teachers and other professionals in our systems. I think over the last 15, 20 years, we've gotten beaten up pretty bad when it comes to the national dialogue about what these adults are doing on behalf of kids. I think some of it's warranted, but largely these are professionals that are spending a tremendous amount of time trying to do great things on behalf of kids and not necessarily getting the recognition that they might deserve for the work that they're investing.
Yeah, this isn't a question. I've seen this too, but also more broadly, not just talking about teachers, but I feel like the discourse that I see as a reporter nationally, it's sadly cynical. I mean, one of the things that jumped out at me covering the teacher walkouts, I don't remember what state it was, but at one point in the process, before the governor ultimately conceded, he said, I have X amount of dollars and I had intended to spend these on our roads. And it just seems to me like at some point nationally, educating our kids became just a thing we put in the pecking order. And I don't know when that happened or why that happened. Sorry, I guess I'm just soapboxing now. But anyway, is there anything else that you four wonderful people would like to say before I open this thing up to questions?
Let's go for it.
All right. Well, I have one from Betsy Wolf, an assistant professor at Johns Hopkins. What do we know about impacts on student outcomes and equity in funding of various approaches, e.g. staffing models, student-based budgeting, etc.? What are the trade-offs of each, and is there a best choice?
So to the best of my knowledge, the research, and there are people in this room who know more than me on this, but the research does not look at outcomes based on the model by which the funding is distributed, but rather the amount of funding. We've seen some recent research about providing additional funding, particularly to higher need kids, which have shown some positive outcomes for providing those additional funds to higher need kids, which has been really important research to all those of you who have been doing that. But I'm not aware of any research that links particular funding models to funding outcomes, but it's also not my best area.
Yeah, that's my knowledge. I don't think, well, this notion of kind of funding formulas within districts itself has been, I would say, on the fringes. I mean, we only have, maybe a couple dozen districts in the entire country that have pursued a student-based budgeting model, weighted student funding model. It's known by kind of various forms, but the vast majority, 99.9% of districts will staff based on people. They'll basically send an FTE to a school site based on a number of kids. There hasn't been really much study that I'm aware of that would indicate one direction or the other. I would also say that where we do know that some of this really matters is the way that schools in particular will use adults' time, right? The way that they create time for collaboration amongst those adults, the way that they invest in professional development of those teachers and of instructional coaches and other school-based staff as a means to drive towards some outcome that the school is really interested in.
I would say also, we discussed a little bit earlier this idea of that while funding may become more equitable across districts, most funding formulas do not require school districts to use their funds in certain ways. And so, that really has an impact on outcomes as well, because if it all goes, let's say, for teacher pay increases or for building, modifications or something like that, then you don't really have apples to apples across what might be the same funding formula in two different places.
I'm reminded of one question I wanted to put to you all that's related. Do you think that this requirement in ESSA of districts to report school-level spending will at least change the conversation about equity and potentially lead to more equitable distribution of funds within districts, or is it just too early to know?
I think it's a good development I think it's a very good development that it was in there. And it was interesting. So in Illinois, the funding formula does include that. In the context of the conversations and the debate, it really wasn't something that was controversial. People seem to welcome it, and the transparency is a good thing. I think what we'll find is that it is just another good lever, and that we'll find that there is smarter ways to spend across the school district. And certainly in Illinois, we have a lot of school districts. There's no such thing as sort of a county-wide school district in Illinois. So.
I think the transparency is an extremely good thing. From our work with parents around Connecticut, we know that a lot of them are really interested to have a better understanding of what equity looks like, not only between districts, but also between schools within a district. And I think this requirement for the first time will really allow all of us to look within what has sort of been a black box of what happens to the money after it gets to the district, to be able to see how is that money then being distributed within the district. And I think for the first time will allow us to take a wide look is that funding being distributed equitably or not? So I think it's an important and exciting development.
Yeah, the transparency element of the ESSA school level per pupil reporting requirement, I think, is tremendous. I would say that in the pursuit of the technical detail of figuring out how you ascribe certain expenditures to schools, or how you think about centralized services, how you would allocate payroll dollars, or how you would allocate human resources dollars to those various schools, I think are important kind of insider baseball considerations. I think the more important consideration here is how you support local administrators to actually talk about this with their communities. I think to a lot of superintendents and to a lot of chief financial officers and chief academic officers, this potentially is a bit of a bomb. And I think the way you get away from them saying this is simply another federal requirement that has nothing to do with anything we're doing in this community, that if you were to provide them with a path about how they can discuss this with their community in a productive way, you're going to get a lot more utility out of a requirement like this.
A bomb because you think it will reveal inequitable spending?
Inevitably, it's going to. I think the challenge is going to be the caveats that you place around the data itself. And right now, the guidance is, well, there is no guidance that states are receiving from the feds, states receiving from the feds, about how to think about these dollars. Now, there's some supports out there, and I think that they've been really positive. And I think folks are really looking for some type of guidance from the feds about how to think about the technical detail of this. But the other side of it, the how, is super important. And for a district administrator, a former district administrator, I could sit here all day and rattle off all the reporting requirements we still have in school districts and schools. But if we really want this to have the impact that I understand was intended when it was written into law, you have to carefully consider the how of talking about this with the technical detail of the actual reporting.
Yeah, I think to your point, it can either be a really productive conversation or it can be a really adversarial conversation. And I think that the type of guidance you're talking about, how do local administrators talk with parents, families, community members about what is in this data, what does this data mean? A lot of it is going to be new information for those administrators themselves. Many of them have not seen it before either. And I think making sure that there are opportunities for conversations to have a really productive conversation within a community if this data shows that this doesn't align to our priorities and this isn't how we want to be distributing our funds. How is it that we get to that place where the community wants to be without it becoming sort of an adversarial situation between the district administration and the community?
And I would add, just to pick up on your point, I think it's very important that, especially in low-income communities where parents may not be as engaged with the schools as they might otherwise be, this is a real opportunity. It's an opportunity for them to understand what makes a school good, why they would be concerned about how dollars are being used within their school system. So I think it's a very big opportunity for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right, let's open it up to the room. There are microphones, mobile microphones, so just raise your hand and I'll grab you. I've got a question in the back first.
Hi, thank you all for this conversation. I think it's extremely important. I'm from a state, from Florida, where the voucher debate is raging, and I'm curious as to what the panelists think. Several of you mentioned about the political implications and the ramifications of how these conversations are being had and how that affects how we spend, how we talk about spending money where. And I'm curious as to what you all think is the impact of that debate on funding in general, the school voucher debate, especially as it might impact lower income students or Black and brown students.
Should we take it?
Go for it.
So there is an element of, there's a tax credit scholarship in the bill that implemented the school funding formula in Illinois. It was a very heated debate. It's one that continues to go on. Relative to the whole package, it's $75 million, so it's not a small amount, but it is, when you look at the big picture, it is a relatively small amount. It was, frankly, needed to get this thing over the finish line. And it was late development. It was not anything that the advocates around the school funding formula, including Stan, was pushing, but it was added at the last minute by leadership. That's what we had to do. Whether or not it continues on remains to be seen. There are many who would like it to go away. It's been an issue in the political campaigns that have been going on since then, so it remains to be seen.
Vouchers have not been a substantial part of the conversation in Connecticut, but I have very serious concerns about public education dollars going to private schools that are not overseen by the state, where there is not accountability testing for those schools, so we don't have any idea what the quality is. I'm particularly concerned that this could negatively impact low-income students, students of color, and I'm concerned that it could have those impacts and we wouldn't know, right? So if we're sending students to a school that doesn't have to participate in any kind of accountability reviews, and those students are not doing well, we don't even know that those students are not doing well, and that is a very significant concern to me. I think it's important that public dollars stay within the public system where we have school accountability and we can monitor the progress and achievement of those students and have the authority, quite frankly, as a state government or local government to intervene in those schools if they're not doing well.
Yeah, just to add another perspective there, I think that we in a lot of states, the kind of opportunity to enable districts to be responsive to any kind of range of choice policies. You could be talking about vouchers, you could be talking about charters, is just not there. And when you think about the kind of bread and butter of what drives local governments, local school districts, it is their ability to stay fiscally solvent. And in places where you've seen choice policies kind of flourish, those systems have really struggled to kind of maintain some level of fiscal solvency that I think disrupts the ability of the rest of the system to be responsive to kids, frankly. And so I think that that's combinations of both the state and locality talking through what are the types of policies that need to be in place that actually allow you to be responsive to choice policies in the first place. I think this goes back to one of the things that we were talking about earlier, is that to pursue a set of funding reforms in isolation is a fool's errand. You need to consider the impacts that that has on a whole other range of other ed policies in a state and a locality as a means to create a comprehensive package towards some outcome that you desire.
I'd like to actually add my thoughts to that too. I don't know much about Florida's system, but I went down the rabbit hole last year in Indiana, which has, I believe it's still the largest voucher program in the country. And one of the things that I found, I heard it from a number of administrators, public school administrators across the state, and then I saw it in the data, because Indiana's system is really relaxed insofar as accountability, not just accountability, but allowing private schools to basically screen students to their heart's desire. What we found being there in the data, anecdotally, is that private schools were turning away, especially vulnerable students, students with disabilities, because they were allowed to say, well, we can't serve you, we can't accommodate you. And so I know specifically, I heard from the superintendent at Fort Wayne, she was saying, you know, I'm serving the students with disabilities in Fort Wayne because I have to, I want to, I'm obligated by law to do it, and I'm gonna do it the very best I possibly can. But I am also losing an awful lot of students to the private schools in Fort Wayne, and none of them are students with disabilities. And at some point, because this funding is their public school dollars, they're going to these private schools, they're taking students who are going to cost those private schools a lot less than many of the students that, say, the superintendent in Fort Wayne is doing her very best to serve. It's a continuum, and obviously, you know, you run into this really difficult debate about what you can and cannot require of a private school the moment they start accepting public dollars, and that conversation really varies, I think, from state to state. You run headlong into civil rights law, et cetera, but it's definitely a conversation worth having and paying close attention to. Another question? Yes, sir, in the front there.
I believe I read in The Economist that there's been a phenomenal increase in graduation rates in Chicago. High schools, what happened?
Well, you know that we're having a mayoral election in March? In the spring, yeah, it's in the spring. So it's an interesting question because our schools have improved their graduation rates. Our schools as a total. But there are schools in districts and areas throughout Chicago whose graduation rates have not improved. And there are resource allocation issues to those schools. There is a lot of data being thrown around, for lack of a better word, that says that, you know, we've solved our schools' problems and that we are on par with some of the best schools in the country. And I would say that many families in many schools in the city of Chicago would beg to differ with those results that you're hearing about what's going on in Chicago.
So can I comment?
Yeah.
And I think you're referring to Dr. Reardon's study from Stanford, and there are some fundamental things that were done by Chicago Public Schools which contributed to that success rate. Full day kindergarten, a longer school day, a very heightened attention on principal quality, for example. I think those are all incredible accomplishments, and Chicago is literally leading Illinois in student academic growth. They're carrying the state just in terms of how our state is trending up academically. And so I think the next challenge, and I think the message that it sort of resonates through all of this, is the work is never done. And so getting that more, just getting that, continuing that work and continuing to get it across the cities is our next challenge.
Can I put an exclamation?
There's- yeah.
Sorry.
So,
No, no,
please,
no,
please,
sorry.
by all
Please
means.
finish.
No.
Just to put an exclamation point on the things that Chicago has been doing. In partnership with the Chicago Consortium for School Research, they have been pushing a tremendous effort around getting adults to use the right set of data to point to kids that need the supports to kind of get across the line when it comes to graduation. And so when it comes to thinking about the way that adults talk with one another about the students and the needs of those students, I would say Chicago is actually one of the districts nationally that is leading that conversation, which is probably attributable to them leading the way in Illinois altogether. So I think that just underlining this idea that putting the right set of data in the hands of adults that need it at the right time is a really kind of timely conversation as we think about driving some of the more summative and kind of well-known outcomes that we desire in our system.
And the level at which people are surprised to learn about this constantly surprises me.
Yeah.
And so going back to kind of like lessons learned and common themes and so forth, the work is never done. Translating this into ways where parents in all different kinds of communities can understand it and appreciate it is essential. And I think that is a frontier which folks in this sort of business don't do enough. And so I think it's really sort of a moral imperative to be able to think about that and do that.
Yes.
Would you consider teacher allocation policy to be a school finance policy in your states? And is that part of the discussion? I ask this because some systems outside the U.S. centrally allocate their teachers based on need. And other systems create incentives for teachers to work in difficult to staff schools or more disadvantaged schools to create more equity. Would this be a school, in your opinion, is this a school finance policy?
So I think there's a link. So I think there's definitely a link between resource equity and making sure that all kids have equitable access to high quality teachers. So if our highest need districts do not have the resources that they need in order to be able to pay teachers salaries that are competitive with lower need, suburban, more affluent districts, then obviously those higher need districts are going to have a very difficult time attracting teachers because not only are they not paying on par with suburban districts, but obviously the working conditions in those districts may be more stressful. There are a lot of reasons it might be harder to attract teachers to those districts. So I think there is a strong link between making sure that our high need districts have the resources that they need and ensuring that there is an equitable allocation of teachers. On the other hand, I come from Connecticut. It's a New England state. We have a very firm and strong belief in local control. And I can't imagine a scenario in which like the state government started allocating teachers to school districts. I don't see the state government being on board with that. I don't see teachers or school districts being on board with that. But certainly there is a relationship between resource equity and equitably allocating teachers.
We have some examples in the country. Places like North Carolina that use allotment systems in which to allocate teachers to districts. And you actually see examples in which there are continued resource equities in states like that, even with a system in which the central state government is allocating FTE. And I think you have examples like Connecticut.
Yeah, they're allocating FTE for money though. They're not saying this specific human being's going to this district.
That's
right?
true. What they're doing is they're basically providing FTE counts to the district, and then the district will then allocate appropriately. It's really in the equation of the way in which they're calculating the dollars behind the FTE allocations. And I know that there's been some work that's been done in North Carolina to investigate that, but if you were to ask folks in North Carolina, they actually really appreciate the allotment system because it allows them to focus on some of the other challenges that are happening in the state.
Someone else. Another question over in the back.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for this insightful panel. I'm wondering if you all see in your states metrics related to intentionally diverse schools or school discipline play into your school formula, and how that may play out.
So they don't play into our education funding formula. They do play into our state's accountability system for schools and districts, which I'm not going to discuss in detail because I am not an expert on it. There's a lot of information on Connecticut's State Department of Education website. So the state is looking at that and taking it into account and measuring school quality and holding schools accountable for that, but it isn't part of the funding formula.
Yeah, I think similarly, I can cite California. They don't have a mechanism in their funding formula directed towards kind of discipline, school safety policies, but they do note in their accountability system that school climate, issues of discipline, expulsion, or all metrics that are collected in California is something that the state cares about and really is encouraging localities to fund appropriately to address those issues in their schools, which I think kind of more broadly kind of raises this point about how both state and local school districts work together to establish policies that, I guess I'll use the word trust enough that school districts are going to allocate resources in a manner that addresses the things that the state really cares about. And obviously we've got kind of a long road ahead of us in many states in that regard, but it's really developing that relationship and that sense of trust that local administrators can use dollars appropriately to meet the needs of those kids.
Nora, I saw you had a question.
Thanks. I was thinking back to when you were talking about the coalition building part of kind of demand for equitable school finance regimes in your states. And I'm curious if any of your states you feel like employers have been a big part of that, if they're interested in being in the coalitions. I feel like in all this ed policy stuff, you sort of hear from employers when you're talking about career technical, but then you're also hearing that employers can't, find the workers they need. And how much do they think about the level of funding or really think about the equity as something that's contributing to their problems?
So in Illinois, in the school funding debate per se, I would say that the business community, while interested in following it, was not terribly engaged in it. Now, as we go to the point of we've got the funding formula done and they're looking more towards career and technical and so forth, opportunities that the business community is getting more engaged.
Yeah, I would agree somewhat with that, but I would say also that the business community is way more interested in our higher education system than they are in our K through 12 system. Even though the two have to work together and one feeds into the other, there is a very strong connection to the schools that provide those skills, especially post-graduation, for those industries that are considered growth industries in the state of Illinois and especially in the city.
In Connecticut, they did not play a significant role in a coalition in pushing school funding forward. Certainly, they were interested in following along. I think the business community has challenges between concerns like, is this going to cost more money and lead to increased taxes versus concerns about prepared students? And I think this is not a super easy question for them. It's also my experience actually in Connecticut that they're very interested in K-12 education and making sure that students who graduate are ready for college and career, but the focus has not so much been on funding policies, it's been on other areas of education policy.
Any more questions? We've got time for one or two more. Don't be shy. Am I missing it? Oh, there we go.
Hi, so thank you so much for the conversation. And I wanted to bring us back to the discipline piece. I'm from Los Angeles, California, and I know, and we've been boots on the ground fighting for LCFF money. And I know one of the major issues that we had with the Los Angeles Unified School District funding was that they allocated money to school police. So in LA, we have our own school police system that isn't a part of LAPD. And they have $60 million a year. And I think you mentioned, like, if we go outside of, like, looking and fighting for the scraps within education and looking at policing in general, there's more money. But even within the school district, they were still trying to put LCAP money into policing, opposed to other things that people needed. So I was wondering, was this something you all saw in your states? And if it was something that you saw in your states, what were the on-the-ground movements that tried to push back against funding school police?
So, You know, there was a bill, Senate Bill 100, that was running sort of, and it went on a much faster track than the whole school funding debate, which took years and years and years. That was handled very capably and wonderfully by a group of advocates. So I would say it was a timing thing, and I think also the interest in sort of local control through the formula was another element of it. But I would love to talk to you more and find out about what you guys are doing.
All right, I've got another question from online. This might be our last. Can you talk about weighting and the various categories of students drawing down additional dollars? For example, California added foster children for the first time, and how a state might build into its continuous improvement and monitoring process how these weights should be structured and adjusted.
So I'll go back to one of the kind of comments that I was making earlier, that there's been some study of this through kind of cost studies where they've, within states have tried to identify the kind of dollars necessary to put towards certain types of students. Foster youth was, in California's case, a very unique student group that was put into the law, but I think rightfully so, has brought a level of attention to this student group that is extraordinarily vulnerable. In my experience when I was in San Jose, when we looked at this population, we had about 275 of them in San Jose Unified. San Jose Unified serves about 30,000 kids in the city. And these kids' experiences were just extraordinary. I mean, they're, let alone like changing classrooms every year, they were changing homes every 6 to 9 months. The types of services that they would have to, or they would need access to, the hoops they would have to jump through, basic stuff like transportation to school and meals before and after school were just extraordinary. So I think it shines a light in a place that we haven't seen before. But again, I think this is a lot of trial and error. Like, we don't have a set of research that would say, for a low-income kid, this is the amount of money, or for an English learner, this is the amount of money. I think that's largely in the realm of a state's dialogue and discussion about what is the funding necessary for those types of student that would help to inform or enact that type of work in a state. Hawaii might be a real good place to look. I know it's not a traditional state in that regard, but they've had a weighted student funding formula in play now, I think, for at least 15 or 20 years, in which they've gone through several iterations of that work.
All right, I think we've got time for one more. Who wants it? Oh, come on. Yeah.
Earlier, somebody talked about the assumption in the sort of changing of the formulas that the economy would keep going up and booming. I wonder if there are any thoughts or provisions for what happens if there's a recession, if property values fall.
Politics is an optimistic sport. I mean, no. In Connecticut, the answer to that is no. So the assumption, not just in school funding, but I think generally in the way that the state looks at budgeting, is an assumption that the economy is going to continue to grow, tax revenues will, for the most part, continue to go up, that we are not going to experience any future recessions. Obviously, there are probably many economists sitting in this room who know that that is impossible, that we will never experience another recession, or at least extremely unlikely. But in Connecticut, no, it certainly didn't take that into account. I think that there are things that we could do within the structure of the policy to deal with that kind of a situation, but they didn't specifically write in a provision that would deal with that.
Governor Brown has been kind of notorious in his state about saying, in addition to putting money into more social services, including K-12, we are putting money aside into a reserve to account for the next recession. He knows it. Every economist in California knows that at some point it's coming, and that given the tax structure in a place like California, they have to do it because it's so tied to, frankly, you can draw it all the way to Wall Street. In other places where property taxes offer more of a base, you're not going to see as big of an impact, but you will see it. But you see probably more of a rise in states in which they're recognizing the kind of rainy day fund type policy. So they're doing a better job at that, I think, getting smarter about creating those buffers in place. But I don't think it's ever going to completely prevent cuts to K-12 education when you see the economy start to retract within states. But we do see that states are getting a bit smarter at those kinds of policies.
Yeah. And before I get myself in trouble back home, Connecticut does have a rainy day fund, which they put a bunch of money into this year from a tax windfall. It's not specifically earmarked for education, but it certainly is helpful to have at least some cash on hand.
Yeah, in Illinois, we're going to have to fix the fact that we are so reliant on local property wealth, and that's going to come back and bite us. So only 25% of school funding comes from the state, as opposed to about 50%, which is what the average is across the country. There is a smart, I think a very smart aspect of the formula, which is that, I think I mentioned earlier, there's a hold harmless and the new money has to flow in, and that's equitably distributed through the formula. If you don't do at least $350 million, then there's a structure that's built in there so that the wealthiest districts actually are impacted first, and that gets them engaged in the debate and so forth. And so it's sort of it's a way to try to get us at least slowly building up to adequacy over time. So hopefully we'll be able to keep our eye on the ball in the event that something like that would happen with the economy.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank the panelists and all of you for listening, and invite you all to stay. I'm sure you've noticed the cupcakes making the way to the wall. So please stick around, and this was fun. Thanks for hanging out.
Thank you.